Pretend to be my mate, ordered the Alpha King. One condition stopped the Omega heart. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to Elena Moore. The great hall of Blackthorn Keep breathed with a quiet authority, a place where stone remembered every decision ever spoken within it. And Elena felt that memory settle on her shoulders the moment she stepped across the threshold. She kept her gaze level, her hands folded, her posture precise, because Omegas survived by reading rooms the way sailors read weather. And today the air carried a warning. Caleb Blackthorn stood at the center, unmoving, his presence measured and deliberate, the kind of stillness that made others adjust themselves without realizing why. He did not raise his voice when he spoke her name, yet it traveled the length of the hall as if the walls had agreed to carry it for him. Elena Moore. The sound of it was not a question. She took one step forward, then another, counting them in her head, a habit learned long ago when counting was the only thing that kept her steady. Around them, the court held its breath, curiosity sharpening into expectation, because when the Alpha King addressed an Omega publicly, nothing about it was ordinary. Caleb's eyes met hers, not cold, not warm, simply assessing, as though he were measuring distance on a map only he could see. Pretend to be my mate, he said, clear and even, the words arranged with care, the order delivered without cruelty and without softness. Elena did not flinch, and that alone startled a few onlookers, because surprise usually lived on an Omega's face in moments like this. She did not look down either. She waited. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, just long enough to remind everyone who controlled it. She heard her own heartbeat, steady, almost too calm, as if it had decided to protect her by slowing everything else down. For how long? She asked, her voice quiet but unbroken, and a ripple passed through the hall because she had not said yes or no, not yet. Caleb studied her, perhaps noticing the way her fingers remained still, perhaps noticing the absence of hope in her eyes, and for the first time something shifted behind his expression. Long enough to satisfy the council, he replied, and then, as if adding a footnote to a contract, he set the condition that would change the shape of the air between them. There will be no bond, no claim, no expectation beyond appearance. This is only for show. Elena felt the words land somewhere deep, not sharp, not loud, but final, like a door closing with a careful click. The Omega part of her, the part that had learned to wait for possibility without naming it, went very quiet. She nodded once, because agreement was safer than disappointment, and because pretending was something she already knew how to do. Around them, the court exhaled, satisfied, already rewriting the story in their minds. But Elena remained still, listening to the steady beat in her chest resume, slower than before, as if it were reminding her of a rule she would not break. Survival first, hope later, if at all. Elena learned quickly that pretending required precision, not imagination, because imagination invited hope, and hope was a liability she had learned to manage. The morning after the order, she was escorted through corridors she had only ever cleaned at a distance, corridors measured in feet and memory, where banners whispered history and footsteps echoed longer than they should. She was given a suite that overlooked the eastern courtyard, a view wide enough to make a person feel small, and she cataloged the details the way she always did, the width of the windows, the weight of the door, the sound the latch made when it closed, because knowing a place made it safer. Servants addressed her with careful respect now, their voices smoother, their pauses longer, and she answered with calm courtesy, never correcting them when they stumbled over the title they were not sure she deserved. She chose her clothes without flourish, fabrics that moved easily in colors that did not demand attention, because she understood the difference between being seen and being studied. When Caleb joined her for the first public appearance, a brief walk through the courtyard timed to coincide with the council's arrival, he did not touch her, not even by accident, and she noticed how deliberate that absence was, how it drew eyes more effectively than a gesture would have. They walked side by side at an even pace, her stride measured to match his without hurrying, and she kept her gaze forward, aware of the watchers, aware of the unspoken narrative forming with each step. Inside, she repeated the condition to herself: no bond, no claim, no expectation, a clean sentence with no room for interpretation, and she felt steadier for it. Caleb spoke to her only when necessary. Short exchanges about schedules and appearances, his tone professional, almost distant, and she appreciated the clarity even as something in the quiet unsettled her. It was easier when he was commanding. Silence required interpretation. During a council luncheon, she stood at his right, hands folded, listening as voices rose and fell around them, and she answered questions when addressed, concise and respectful, never overstepping, never retreating. A few glances lingered on her longer than politeness required, measuring her usefulness, her compliance, and she met them with composure, because composure was a shield that did not crack under inspection. Later, alone again, she sat by the window and watched the courtyard empty, counting the distance between the far gate and the fountain, roughly 60 feet by her estimate, because counting kept her anchored. She thought of the word mate and felt nothing stir, not because she was numb, but because she had learned where to place feelings when they threatened to interfere. When Caleb finally spoke to her privately that evening, it was to clarify tomorrow's itinerary, his voice even, his eyes attentive in a way that suggested he was cataloging data rather than emotion, and she responded in kind, confirming times, confirming locations, confirming the limits they had agreed upon without needing to say them aloud. As he turned to leave, she thanked him, not for the arrangement, but for the clarity, and something flickered across his expression, brief and unreadable, before it vanished. Alone once more, Elena stood in the quiet and acknowledged the truth she would not share with anyone else. That pretending did not hurt because it was false. It hurt because it was familiar, and familiarity had a way of teaching the heart how to stop before it could be broken. The condition did not echo loudly when it settled between them. It arrived quietly, like a rule learned too young, and Elena felt its weight in the small adjustments she made without thinking. She woke before dawn and dressed with care, selecting garments that fit precisely and concealed nothing essential, because excess invited questions. In the mirror, she practiced the expression that belonged to a companion in name only, attentive without longing, present without reaching, and she noted the steadiness of her breathing as a small victory. Throughout the morning, she moved through scheduled appearances with practiced ease, nodding at greetings, answering politely when addressed, and maintaining the careful distance that had already become part of her posture. When Caleb appeared beside her at the council antechamber, she sensed the room recalibrate, voices lowering, steps aligning, and she recognized how power reshaped space long before it reshaped people. He spoke to her briefly, a reminder about the evening reception, his words precise and neutral, and she replied with equal clarity, confirming the time, the order of arrival, the expected duration, because logistics were safer than interpretation. The condition hovered unspoken, yet it guided every exchange, a boundary line drawn cleanly and respected by both, and she felt the strange relief of knowing exactly where not to step. During the reception, she stood at his side as planned, her presence acknowledged and then accepted, and she observed how expectations softened into routine once the narrative stabilized. She smiled when required, listened when appropriate, and declined invitations with courtesy, citing schedule and duty rather than preference, because preference was a door she kept closed. At one point, Caleb leaned closer to clarify a detail over the low hum of conversation, his voice calm, his tone unchanged, and she noted the care with which he maintained the distance they had agreed upon, as if honoring the condition required vigilance. The realization surprised her, not because it felt kind, but because it felt intentional. Later, when the hall emptied and the lights dimmed, she found herself alone again, standing near the wide windows, watching the courtyard lights trace clean lines across the stone. She placed a hand over her chest and felt the steady rhythm there, slower than it had once been, as if her heart had learned a new tempo designed for survival. She remembered the moment he had stated the condition, the absence of cruelty in his voice, the certainty that had followed, and she understood that the pain had not come from refusal but from recognition. She had recognized a familiar pattern, usefulness without belonging, presence without claim, and her body had responded by quieting everything that might complicate it. When Caleb joined her briefly to confirm the next day's schedule, she met his gaze and answered efficiently, and when he paused as if considering another question, she waited without prompting, because waiting was something she had mastered. He dismissed her with a nod, respectful and contained, and as he turned away, she felt a subtle shift, not in the room, but in herself, a confirmation rather than a wound. The condition had done what conditions often did. It simplified the world by narrowing it, and Elena accepted that simplicity with the calm of someone who knew how to endure, even as a small, unacknowledged truth settled alongside it, that the quiet it demanded was not empty, only carefully sealed. Public illusion became a skill Elena refined without being asked, because the court learned faster than it admitted, and she learned faster than it noticed. Days passed measured in schedules and appearances, each one reinforcing the same quiet image, the Alpha King at ease with his chosen companion, the Omega steady at his side, composed, unremarkable in the way that made people stop questioning. She felt eyes follow her everywhere, weighing, comparing, searching for cracks, and she offered none, because restraint was a language she spoke fluently. When she entered rooms beside Caleb, conversations adjusted, chairs shifted, and attention bent toward them, and she understood that presence alone could rewrite hierarchy without a single word. She did not cling to him, did not seek his attention, and that absence became its own statement, one that unsettled those who expected gratitude or ambition. At dinners, she spoke when spoken to, her responses thoughtful but brief, careful not to outshine, careful not to disappear, and she watched how approval grew not from affection but from predictability. Caleb remained consistent, his manner toward her unchanged, respectful, distant, precise, and she noted how others interpreted that distance as confidence rather than coldness. Rumors softened, curiosity dulled, and the narrative settled into something acceptable, something easy to repeat. Yet beneath that surface, Elena became aware of small deviations, moments when Caleb's attention lingered half a second longer than necessary, or when his gaze tracked her movement across a room before he seemed to realize he was doing it. She cataloged these moments without assigning meaning, because meaning was dangerous, and she had already learned the cost of misplaced interpretation. During a formal gathering at the Eastern Terrace, she stood near the balustrade while Caleb addressed a group of council members, the city lights stretching beyond them like a measured grid, and she listened without appearing to listen, her posture relaxed, her hand still. A comment reached her ears, softly spoken but not quietly enough, a suggestion that she was fortunate, that many would envy her position, and she acknowledged it with a polite smile that revealed nothing. Fortune implied chance, and chance implied hope, and she allowed neither into her calculations. When the evening ended and they walked back through the corridors together, their footsteps echoed in unison, and she felt the strange steadiness of walking beside someone without reaching for them. Caleb broke the silence once, remarking on how smoothly the evening had gone, and she agreed, noting the efficiency of preparation, because efficiency was neutral ground. He paused as if expecting more, then inclined his head and continued on, leaving her at the entrance to her suite with a courteous farewell. Alone, Elena leaned briefly against the closed door, not in exhaustion, but in acknowledgement, recognizing the effort it took to maintain a role so carefully constructed. She reviewed the day the way she always did, assessing what had worked, what had shifted, and she recognized the subtle danger of success, that the illusion was becoming convincing not only to others, but to parts of herself she preferred to keep quiet. The condition remained intact, unchallenged and clear, yet she felt its edges more distinctly now, as if the space it defined was being tested by the very ease with which they occupied it. She straightened, moved to the window, and watched the city settle into night, reminding herself that appearances were tools, not truths, and that survival sometimes required inhabiting a role so fully that forgetting it was an act of discipline. When she finally rested, her thoughts were orderly, contained, and she slept with the calm of someone who believed she understood the limits of her world, even as the public illusion she upheld began to press against those limits, asking questions she was not yet ready to answer. The first sign that the illusion was fracturing did not come from gossip or scrutiny, but from Caleb himself, and Elena recognized it by what did not happen rather than what did. He stopped correcting others when they deferred to her, stopped redirecting attention away from her opinions during brief strategic discussions, and she noticed how silence followed her words now, not because they were unexpected, but because they were being considered. This unsettled her more than open resistance ever had. She had learned how to endure dismissal, but acknowledgement carried a different weight. During a planning session in the smaller council chamber, she offered a logistical observation, nothing ambitious, merely a clarification about timing and resource allocation, and Caleb nodded once, immediately adjusting the schedule to reflect it. The room accepted the change without comment, and Elena felt the shift ripple outward, subtle and irreversible. Afterward, as they walked through a side corridor lit by tall windows, Caleb slowed his pace to match hers more precisely than before, and she realized that he had been doing so unconsciously. The thought tightened something in her chest, not painfully, but enough to demand attention. She reminded herself of the condition, the clean boundary that had made this possible, and she kept her gaze forward, her posture unchanged. That evening, during a smaller gathering meant to appear informal, she noticed how Caleb's focus followed her movements through the room, not possessively, but attentively, as if her position mattered to the overall balance of the space. When a guest spoke over her, Caleb interjected smoothly, inviting her to continue, his tone calm, his expression neutral, and the guest apologized without protest. Elena completed her thought, thanked them, and moved on, but inside she felt the crack widen, because protection had not been part of the agreement. Later, when they stood alone near the gallery overlooking the courtyard, Caleb spoke without preamble, asking if she was comfortable with the increasing expectations placed upon her. The question was practical, reasonable, and entirely unnecessary, and that was what unsettled her most. She answered honestly, stating that she could manage, that clarity remained helpful, and he accepted her response, though his gaze lingered as if searching for something she had not offered. The days that followed confirmed the pattern. Caleb began consulting her privately on matters that did not require her presence, asking for perspective rather than confirmation, and she responded with the same measured care she applied to everything else. She did not ask why, did not comment on the change, because naming it might solidify something she was determined to keep fluid. Yet the cracks continued to spread, small but persistent, moments when his attention sharpened at the sound of her voice, when his expression shifted in response to her absence from a room. Elena felt the condition pressing against her from both sides now, not as a restriction, but as a fragile support holding something back. One evening, after a long day of appearances, she paused outside her suite and realized that she was tired in a way she had not been before, not physically, but in the careful maintenance of distance. She acknowledged the truth she had been avoiding, that the illusion was no longer only for the public, and that Caleb's behavior suggested he was noticing the same thing. Inside, she removed the symbols of her role, the carefully chosen attire, the composed expression, and allowed herself a moment of stillness. She placed a hand over her chest and felt her heart beat steadily, reliably, and she understood that what frightened her was not the possibility of feeling, but the risk that the condition might no longer be enough to keep those feelings contained. When she finally rested, her sleep was lighter, interrupted by thoughts she did not yet have words for, and somewhere beyond her awareness, the balance she had relied upon continued to shift, quietly and persistently, toward a question neither of them had agreed to ask. Control failed quietly, the way it often did, not with defiance but with concern, and Elena sensed the change the moment Caleb began anticipating her needs without asking. He adjusted schedules to reduce her exposure to long evenings, reassigned attendance when he noticed her preference for fewer interruptions, and positioned her closer during gatherings as if proximity itself were a form of reassurance. None of it violated the condition directly, yet each small decision pressed against its edges. Elena responded by restoring distance where she could, arriving a minute later than planned, so she entered rooms alone, declining adjustments that centered her comfort, reminding him with calm precision that predictability served them both. Caleb accepted these reminders, but she noticed how his jaw tightened, how his attention lingered, as if the solution he preferred was not one he could order into existence. During a midweek council review, a minor disagreement arose about the timing of a public address, and Caleb turned to Elena for confirmation without realizing it. The room followed his gaze. She offered a neutral assessment, recommending caution and clarity, and he adopted it immediately. Afterward, in the corridor, he stopped her with a measured request for her time, his tone composed yet intent. He asked whether the increasing attention was becoming burdensome, whether adjustments should be made, whether she felt protected. The last word settled between them with unexpected weight. Elena answered carefully, stating that protection had not been part of their agreement, that efficiency and clarity remained sufficient. Her voice did not waver, but she felt the familiar quiet tighten inside her chest, the practiced stillness that kept her balanced. Caleb listened, nodded once, and said he understood, yet his expression suggested that understanding was not the same as acceptance. That evening, during a reception meant to signal unity, Elena noticed the subtle ways he shielded her from interruptions, redirecting conversations, positioning himself to intercept demands on her time. The gestures were discreet, almost invisible, but she felt their accumulation like pressure. When a guest remarked on her composure, implying she was fortunate to be guided so carefully, Elena smiled and corrected them gently, stating that she was capable and autonomous. Caleb glanced at her, surprised, then inclined his head in agreement, though the moment lingered. Later, alone near the gallery windows, Elena addressed the shift directly, her words calm and deliberate, reminding him of the condition and the balance it created. She thanked him for consideration, then asked him to trust her boundaries. Caleb met her gaze, silent for a long moment, then replied that he did trust her, that his actions were simply precaution. The word felt inadequate, and she recognized the gap between intention and impact widening. In the days that followed, she reclaimed space where she could, choosing independent routes through the keep, scheduling time away from public roles, grounding herself in routine. Yet control continued to fail in smaller ways. Caleb sought her counsel on matters that extended beyond appearances, invited her perspective in private, and watched for her reactions as if they mattered more than outcomes. Elena responded with consistency, never encouraging, never withdrawing completely, holding the line. She had drawn with care. One evening, as they reviewed a forthcoming itinerary, she pointed out an unnecessary appearance and suggested its removal for the sake of efficiency. Caleb agreed, then paused, asking whether she was tired. The question was simple, but it reached too far. Elena answered honestly that she was capable, that capacity was not the issue, and that clarity remained essential. She reiterated the condition, not as a challenge, but as a safeguard. Caleb listened, exhaled slowly, and said he would respect it. When he left, Elena remained by the table, her hand resting on the smooth surface, acknowledging the truth she could no longer ignore, that control was failing not because rules were broken, but because care had entered where command once lived, and care did not obey conditions easily. She steadied herself, reaffirming the boundaries that kept her safe, even as the space between them grew more charged with unspoken questions neither had agreed to ask. The confrontation arrived without ceremony, as inevitabilities often did, in a quiet chamber away from the court where windows overlooked the inner gardens and the air carried the faint scent of evening rain. Elena had chosen the space deliberately because neutrality mattered, and she stood near the window when Caleb entered, her posture composed, her hands steady at her sides. He did not issue an order, did not frame the moment as a request, and that alone marked the difference. He began by stating what he had observed, that she had been withdrawing more carefully, that her routes had changed, that her schedule had tightened around herself rather than the court, and he asked if he had misstepped. The question was measured, but it stripped away the last illusion of command, and Elena felt the weight of it settle. She answered with the honesty she reserved for moments that could not be repeated, explaining that boundaries had shifted, that the condition had begun to blur not because it was ignored, but because it was no longer sufficient to hold the shape of what was happening. Caleb listened without interrupting, his attention fixed, his expression intent in a way that made it clear he was not preparing a response. When he spoke, he acknowledged the change, admitting that control had become difficult, not because she resisted, but because she complied too well, because her calm made him aware of the limits of command. Elena met his gaze then, her voice steady as she named the truth she had protected, that the condition had stopped her heart not in fear, but in recognition, because she had learned long ago what it meant to be useful without being chosen, present without being claimed, and she would not build hope in a space defined by permission. The words settled heavily, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Caleb responded not with defense, but with a question, asking whether the condition had been cruel, whether he had underestimated its cost. Elena shook her head gently, clarifying that it had been clear, and clarity had saved her, but clarity did not erase history, and she had already paid for believing that proximity meant possibility. She explained that her distance was not rejection, but preservation, and that pretending required the absence of expectation to remain safe. Caleb absorbed this in silence, then did something she had not anticipated. He acknowledged his own failure, stating that he had believed structure could contain feeling, that rules could prevent consequence, and that he had been wrong. He admitted that he had begun to care without permission, that his actions had shifted from management to protection, and that protection without consent was still a form of control. Elena felt the tightness in her chest ease slightly, not because the problem was solved, but because it was finally named. She responded by restating her boundary one last time, reminding him that choice mattered more than outcome, that her compliance had never meant consent beyond the agreement they had made. Caleb nodded, his posture softening, and he said he would not ask her to break that boundary, that he would step back rather than press forward, even if doing so required him to relinquish the certainty he preferred. The exchange ended without resolution, but not without recognition, and as Caleb turned to leave, he paused, thanking her for honesty rather than obedience. Elena remained by the window after he left, her reflection faint against the glass, and she acknowledged the quiet shift inside herself, the realization that the confrontation had not shattered the illusion but transformed it, replacing command with awareness and leaving them both standing at the edge of a choice that could no longer be postponed, even as neither had yet reached for it. The reversal did not announce itself with spectacle but with absence, the absence of command where it had always lived. In the days following their confrontation, Caleb altered nothing publicly and everything privately, removing his presence from her schedule, declining to stand beside her unless protocol required it, and instructing the court with careful neutrality that Elena's role remained unchanged by choice rather than decree. Elena noticed immediately, not because the distance grew, but because it became clean, unambiguous, and hers to navigate. The pressure eased, replaced by a quiet that felt earned rather than enforced. When they crossed paths, his gaze held respect without expectation, and she found herself breathing more easily, even as something unfamiliar stirred in the space he had vacated. At a council briefing, he redirected questions meant for her back to their original speakers, not dismissively, but deliberately, restoring autonomy rather than withholding attention. The court adjusted again, slower this time, uncertain, and Elena observed the recalibration with a calm she had not anticipated. That evening, she received a message requesting her presence in the inner garden, phrased as an invitation rather than a summons, and she chose to attend because the choice mattered. The garden was quiet, lit by low lanterns that traced soft arcs across stone paths, and Caleb stood near the fountain, his posture relaxed, his hands empty. He did not close the distance when she approached, did not claim the space between them, and she recognized the effort in that restraint. He spoke plainly, stating that he had reconsidered the condition, not to revoke it unilaterally, but to remove it from the structure entirely. He acknowledged that it had served clarity once, and now served fear, and that fear was not a foundation he wished to build upon. Elena listened, her expression steady, her heart measured, as he continued, explaining that he would not replace the condition with another, would not redefine terms to his advantage, and would not ask for reassurance. Instead, he offered what she had not been given before, a relinquishment of authority in this one domain, stating that whatever existed between them would exist only by mutual choice. The words settled slowly, not as relief, but as gravity, and Elena felt the familiar quiet in her chest respond, not closing, but pausing, as if waiting for instruction she had never received. Caleb then did something symbolic without being theatrical. Stepping back and lowering his gaze briefly, not in submission to her person, but in acknowledgement of her agency, and the gesture carried weight because it was voluntary. He asked a single question, carefully framed, asking whether, without conditions and without pretense, she would consider choosing him in her own time, without pressure and without consequence if she did not. Elena did not answer immediately, because answers given too quickly often belong to fear rather than truth. She told him that the bond he spoke of was not something she could summon on command, that trust rebuilt itself at a human pace, measured in consistency rather than promises. Caleb accepted this without argument, stating that he would wait, not as an alpha exercising patience, but as a man learning it. As they parted, Elena felt a subtle change within herself, not certainty, but space, the kind that allowed breath to deepen and thought to settle. She walked back through the lantern-lit paths alone, aware of her heartbeat, steady and present, and she recognized the quiet truth forming beneath her composure, that choice, once offered, could not be unseen, and that the reversal of power had not diminished either of them, but had finally made room for something real to begin. The ending arrived not as a declaration, but as a morning, clear and ordinary, and Elena understood then that ordinary moments were where choices revealed themselves most honestly. She woke before the bells, the light pale against the windows, and felt something different in her chest, not urgency, not restraint, but a steady awareness that had not been there before. It was not a bond asserting itself or a pull she could name, only a quiet alignment, as if parts of her that had learned to brace were beginning to rest. She dressed without ceremony and walked the familiar corridors alone, noting how the keep felt unchanged and yet newly navigable, every turn available rather than assigned. When she reached the eastern terrace, she found Caleb already there, not waiting in expectation, but present in the way of someone who had learned to arrive without demand. He greeted her without title, his voice calm, his posture open, and she returned the greeting in kind. They stood side by side with space between them, watching the city wake, the measured lines of streets filling with motion, and Elena felt the steady rhythm within her chest respond, not quickening, not retreating, simply present. Caleb spoke once, not to ask for an answer, but to acknowledge the day ahead, the responsibilities that remained unchanged, and she appreciated the normalcy of it. She realized then that what she felt was not certainty, but permission to feel without obligation, permission to consider without fear. As the sun rose higher, Elena noticed a warmth that had nothing to do with proximity, a subtle resonance that moved through her awareness like a familiar note she had forgotten how to recognize. It did not command her attention or claim her thoughts, but it was there, steady and patient, and she understood that if there was such a thing as a bond awakening, it would not do so with force, but with recognition. She turned toward Caleb and met his gaze, seeing no demand there, only presence, and she made a choice that surprised her by how natural it felt. She told him she was willing to begin, not with promises or declarations, but with honesty and time, with shared days rather than defined outcomes. Caleb listened, his expression composed, and nodded, accepting the terms without adjustment, without urgency. He did not step closer, did not reach for reassurance, and Elena felt her heart respond, the steady beat warming, as if acknowledging the safety of being allowed to choose. They walked back together, not touching, not performing, simply moving in parallel, and the keep responded with its usual indifference, unaware that something fundamental had shifted without spectacle. Throughout the day, Elena moved through her duties with a calm she had not known before, noticing how her attention settled rather than scattered, how the quiet inside her no longer felt like restraint. When she crossed paths with Caleb, their exchanges remained measured, but beneath them ran an unspoken understanding that neither needed to define aloud. As evening approached, Elena found herself at the window once more, watching the lights come on across the city, and she placed a hand over her chest, feeling the steady warmth there, alive and responsive. She understood then that her heart had not been stopped, only protected, waiting for a moment when choice could replace command. Somewhere beyond her awareness, the bond she had once feared began to take shape, not as a chain or a claim, but as a shared rhythm, patient and unforced, and Elena allowed herself to breathe into it, trusting that true strength, like true connection, did not demand obedience, only presence.